David Lynch's 1984 adaptation of Dune was plagued by bizarre mishaps that would make even the sandworms of Arrakis cringe. From actors wearing actual body bags as costumes to a director who turned down Star Wars to make this notorious flop, the production was stranger than fiction. Cast members didn't know who each other were, filming locations reeked of rotting flesh, and the lead actor's casting was a complete accident. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Dune, 1984. Fact 1. Guild costumes were real body bags. The distinctive black suits worn by the mysterious guild members in David Lynch's 1984 Dune weren't actually designed for the movie at all. Instead, costume designer Bob Ringwood and his team discovered these eerie outfits in the most unexpected place, an abandoned fire station in San Diego that had been collecting dust since the 1920s. What makes this discovery truly shocking is that these weren't just vintage costumes or props gathering dust in storage. These were actual body bags that had been used multiple times to transport real dead bodies over the decades. The fire station had kept them as part of their emergency equipment, and when the production team found them, they were struck by how perfectly the dark, form-fitting bags matched the alien aesthetic Lynch was trying to achieve for the guild scenes. Ringwood later revealed in a 2006 DVD featurette that his costume department was working under incredible time pressure, needing to create roughly 8,000 to 9,000 clothing pieces for the massive production. This led to many creative shortcuts and the repurposing of unusual materials, including automobile parts and homemade harnesses, but nothing quite as macabre as the guild costumes. The most disturbing aspect of this story isn't just that the actors were wearing genuine body bags, but that the production team deliberately kept this information secret from the cast throughout the entire filming process. The actors who wore these costumes had no idea they were essentially dressed in what amounted to funeral equipment that had housed actual corpses. It wasn't until production wrapped completely that Ringwood and the costume department finally revealed the true origin of the guild outfits to the unsuspecting actors. By that point, of course, it was too late for anyone to object or feel uncomfortable about what they had been wearing during those mysterious, otherworldly scenes that helped give Dune its unique and unsettling visual atmosphere. Fact 2. Patrick Stewart was cast by mistake. Patrick Stewart's casting as Gurney Halleck in David Lynch's Dune happened because of a genuine case of mistaken identity that could have derailed his entire Hollywood career before it even began. The mix-up occurred when the production team desperately needed to replace actor Aldo Ray, who had been forced to leave the project due to his struggles with alcoholism. Director David Lynch was scrambling to find a replacement actor at the last minute when someone recommended Patrick Stewart for the role. However, Lynch had only seen Stewart performing on stage in a production of Henry IV, where the British actor was wearing heavy theatrical makeup, a long wig, and period costume that made him appear much older and more weathered than he actually was. Based on this single theatrical performance, Lynch formed a completely different mental image of what Patrick Stewart looked like. He expected to meet an older, more rugged-looking actor who matched the tough, battle-scarred appearance he had witnessed on stage. When Stewart showed up for filming with his actual face, younger, smoother, and completely different from the heavily made-up character Lynch remembered, the director was genuinely disappointed and surprised. Stewart himself later confirmed this story at comic conventions, explaining that Lynch had basically hired him thinking he was getting a different-looking person entirely. The actor recalled that Lynch's reaction upon seeing his real appearance was less than enthusiastic, since it didn't match the grizzled warrior image the director had in mind for Gurney Halleck. Despite this awkward beginning, Stewart went on to complete his role in the film, though he later described his experience wearing the uncomfortable stillsuit costume as one of the most physically challenging aspects of the entire production. This casting mistake actually worked out well for Stewart in the long run, as it led to his eventual collaboration with Lynch and opened doors to his later iconic role as Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Fact 3. Stewart had no idea who Sting was. Patrick Stewart's complete ignorance about his famous co-star Sting created one of the most amusing behind-the-scenes moments during the filming of Dune in 1984. At this point in time, Sting was practically a household name around the world, having just released his band's final studio album, Synchronicity, the previous year, which included massive hits like Every Breath You Take that were constantly playing on MTV and radio stations everywhere. Stewart, however, came from a completely different world. As a classically trained theater actor who had spent 16 years with the Royal Shakespeare Company before joining the Dune cast. He later admitted that popular music had never played a big part in his life, leaving him totally isolated from the contemporary music scene that had made Sting an international superstar. The hilarious encounter happened when Stewart decided to strike up a conversation with his co-star during a break in filming. Having heard that Sting was somehow involved in music, Stewart politely asked him if he was a musician. When Sting confirmed that he was, Stewart followed up by asking what instrument he played, and Sting replied that he played bass guitar. Stewart then asked the perfectly reasonable follow-up question about whether Sting performed as a solo artist or if he had a band. Sting explained that he belonged to a group called The Police, which led to Stewart's wonderfully innocent and completely serious response, asking if Sting played in a police band made up of actual law enforcement officers. This moment perfectly captures how different the entertainment worlds of these two actors were at the time. While Sting was dealing with the pressures of being a global rock star transitioning into acting, Stewart was navigating Hollywood as a respected stage actor who was genuinely baffled by the idea that someone might name their rock band after law enforcement. The two eventually cleared up the confusion and developed a good working relationship during the remainder of the production. Fact 4. Lynch turned down Star Wars for Dune. David Lynch made one of the most surprising career decisions in Hollywood history when he turned down the chance to direct Return of the Jedi in order to make Dune instead. This choice becomes even more remarkable when you consider that Lynch had absolutely no experience with science fiction and had never even read Frank Herbert's novel before accepting the project. George Lucas personally approached Lynch in 1983 to offer him the director's chair for what would become the final film in the original Star Wars trilogy. At this point, Lynch had only made 2 feature films, the surreal black and white nightmare Eraserhead, and the critically acclaimed biographical drama The Elephant Man. But Lucas was impressed enough with Lynch's unique visual style to want him for the Star Wars conclusion. Lynch's response to Lucas was characteristically direct and honest. He told the Star Wars creator that the project was "your thing, it's not my thing," essentially acknowledging that he didn't feel the Star Wars universe was a good fit for his particular artistic vision. Lynch encouraged Lucas to direct the finale himself, though Lucas ultimately chose not to take on that responsibility and instead handed the directing duties to Richard Marquand. The irony of Lynch's decision becomes clear when you realize that he then immediately accepted the Dune project despite having zero familiarity with science fiction as a genre. Lynch later admitted that when he took on Dune, he had not read Herbert's novel and knew nothing about the story or the challenges of making science fiction cinema in general. This choice proved to be a costly mistake for Lynch's career. While Return of the Jedi went on to become a massive commercial success and cultural phenomenon, Dune became one of Hollywood's biggest financial disasters and a film that Lynch would later disown completely. The experience was so traumatic for Lynch that he has refused to work in science fiction ever since, making his rejection of Star Wars seem prescient in hindsight. Fact 5. Francesca Annis was pregnant during filming. Francesca Annis, who played the pivotal role of Lady Jessica in David Lynch's Dune, was actually pregnant during the grueling 6-month filming process in Mexico City. What makes this story even more remarkable is that her son was conceived while she was actively working on the production, making the Dune set quite literally the birthplace of her family's newest addition. The British actress had relocated her entire family to Mexico for the extended shoot, which ran from March through September of 1983. This wasn't just a brief location shoot. It was a complete life upheaval that required moving her husband, Patrick, and her daughters to a foreign country for more than half a year while she took on one of the most demanding roles of her career. At the time, Annis was at the peak of her professional success, having won a BAFTA award in 1979 for her acclaimed performance in the television series Lily, and earning recognition for her classical stage work with the Royal Shakespeare Company. Taking on the role of Lady Jessica represented a major departure from her usual period dramas and classical roles, requiring her to navigate the complex world of science fiction while managing the physical and emotional challenges of pregnancy. The logistics of maintaining a family life during such an intensive international production were complicated enough without adding pregnancy to the mix. The family had rented a house in Mexico City, and her husband Patrick took on the responsibility of caring for their daughters when the original plan to enroll them in a local Spanish-speaking kindergarten didn't work out after just 2 days. Annis later revealed that her son's connection to the Dune production became a permanent part of their family story. 38 years later, she would joke about owing Lynch's Dune quite a bit, since the film was directly responsible for bringing her son into the world during what would become one of the most notorious science fiction productions in Hollywood history. Fact 6. Explosive kitchen accident nearly killed Annis. Francesca Annis nearly lost her life during the Dune production when a gas oven exploded directly in her face at the rental house where she was staying with her family in Mexico City. The accident happened because Annis desperately wanted to cook a traditional English roast dinner for her family, despite being explicitly warned by the house owners never to use the second oven in their kitchen. The day of the accident, Annis got into an argument with her husband Patrick about using the forbidden oven, with her daughters running in confused by all the shouting. Against everyone's advice and her better judgment, Annis decided to light the gas oven anyway, determined to prepare the meal she had been craving. She could hear the gas making a hissing sound as she struck the match, but couldn't locate exactly where it was coming from before the massive explosion occurred. The blast was so powerful that it completely burned off her eyebrows, eyelashes, and all the hair around the front of her head. Her permed fringe was left standing straight up at right angles, turned completely white from the heat. When she bent forward to look at herself in the bathroom mirror, all the burned hair simply fell into the sink, and that's when the severe pain from the burns on her face and arms began to set in. Annis was rushed to an American hospital in Mexico City, where she received treatment that quite literally saved her skin. A few years earlier, there had been a terrible plane crash in Mexico, and the United States had sent down a special miracle burn cream to treat the American passengers who were injured. The hospital still had some of this experimental cream in storage, and the doctors applied it to Annis's burns on her face and arms. The accident forced Annis to miss several days of filming, and when she returned to the set, she had no eyebrows or eyelashes. The makeup artist, Gianetto De Rossi, used this opportunity to completely redesign her look, painting on perfect eyebrows and teaching her proper makeup techniques, while her natural features slowly grew back. Fact 7. Filming location was former garbage dump. One of the exterior filming locations for Dune had such a horrific backstory that the cast and crew nicknamed it the Dead Dog Dump, and for good reason. The site, officially called Las Aguilas Rojas, which means the Red Eagles in Spanish, was located outside of Mexico City and had been used by local residents as an unofficial garbage disposal site for years before the film production arrived. When the Dune location scouts first discovered this area, they thought the rocky terrain would be perfect for representing some of the harsh landscapes of the planet Arrakis. However, they quickly realized that the local community had been treating this scenic location as a dumping ground for all kinds of refuse, including things that no film crew should ever have to deal with. Before any cameras could roll, the production company had to hire teams of workers to spend considerable time clearing the area of the accumulated trash that had been left there over the years. This wasn't just typical household garbage. The cleanup crews had to remove animal carcasses in various stages of decomposition, scattered bones from dead animals, broken glass, and all sorts of other hazardous debris that made the location completely unusable for filming. Even after the extensive cleanup efforts were completed and all the visible trash and remains had been hauled away, the location retained a persistent and nauseating smell of rotting flesh that couldn't be eliminated. The odor was so strong and unpleasant that it became impossible for anyone on set to forget what the area had been used for, hence the crew's grim nickname for the place. Despite the disgusting conditions and the lingering stench of decay, the production team decided to proceed with filming at Las Aguilas Rojas because the visual aesthetics of the location were exactly what David Lynch needed for his vision of the desert planet. The cast and crew simply had to endure the awful smell while trying to create the otherworldly atmosphere that would eventually appear on screen, making it one of the most unpleasant working conditions during an already challenging production. Fact 8. Mass food poisoning shut down production. The Dune production faced such severe logistical nightmares in Mexico that filming had to be completely shut down when virtually the entire crew of 1,700 people came down with a devastating case of food poisoning known locally as Montezuma's Revenge. This widespread illness left cast and crew members suffering from severe diarrhea and other stomach problems that made it impossible for anyone to work effectively on the massive production. The food poisoning incident was just one of many infrastructure problems that plagued the shoot from the very beginning. Mexico City in the early 1980s simply wasn't equipped to handle a Hollywood production of this scale, and the crew found themselves dealing with constant rolling blackouts that would knock out power to the sound stages without warning, forcing them to rely on backup generators that didn't always work properly. Communication with the outside world proved to be another major headache, as the entire production was forced to share a single telephone line for all their business needs. This meant that important calls to studios, agents, and suppliers back in Los Angeles often couldn't get through, creating delays and confusion that added to the already mounting production costs. The filming locations themselves presented additional health hazards beyond the food safety issues. Dead animals would appear on various outdoor sets and begin rotting in the Mexican heat, creating unbearable smells and unsanitary conditions that made working outdoors extremely unpleasant for everyone involved in the production. Perhaps most memorably, the cast and crew had to deal with massive cockroach infestations that seemed to appear everywhere they went. These weren't just occasional bugs. The cockroaches were so numerous and persistent that they became a constant presence throughout the filming process, crawling over equipment, costumes, and food areas, despite repeated attempts to eliminate them. The combination of all these problems created a perfect storm of misery that left the American crew members feeling like they were fighting a losing battle against the elements. Director David Lynch later acknowledged that these infrastructure challenges contributed significantly to the overall stress and difficulty of making what would become one of his most troubled productions. Fact 9. Lynch created weirding modules to avoid kung fu on sand dunes. David Lynch made one of the most controversial changes to Frank Herbert's original Dune story when he invented the weirding modules, which were futuristic sound-based weapons that appear nowhere in the source material. Lynch created these devices because he was deeply uncomfortable with how the book's martial arts system, known as the Weirding Way, would translate to the big screen. In Herbert's novel, The Weirding Way was a sophisticated form of combat training used by the Bene Gesserit sisterhood that involved superhuman physical abilities, lightning-fast movements, and advanced fighting techniques that gave practitioners a significant advantage in battle. However, Lynch felt that showing these martial arts sequences on film would end up looking ridiculous and dated, famously stating that he didn't want audiences to see what amounted to kung fu on sand dunes. Instead of adapting the book's fighting system, Lynch invented the weirding modules as microphone-like devices that could convert specific sounds and vocal commands into devastating sonic weapons. In the film, characters could speak certain words or phrases into these modules and create powerful sound waves capable of shattering rock or killing enemies, with Paul's Freeman name Muad'Dib being particularly lethal when spoken into the device. While Lynch's invention was visually interesting and fit with the film's futuristic aesthetic, it created a massive plot hole that he never bothered to address in the screenplay. In the movie, Paul only has access to one weirding module after the Harkonnen attack destroys House Atreides, yet somehow he manages to arm all the Freeman warriors with these devices for their final assault against the Emperor's forces. The film never explains how Paul manufactured dozens or hundreds of these sophisticated weapons in the middle of the desert, or where he obtained the technology and materials needed to mass-produce them. This logical inconsistency became one of the most criticized aspects of Lynch's adaptation, as it undermined the credibility of the story's climactic battle sequences where the Freemen used these unexplained weapons to defeat the supposedly invincible Sardaukar troops. Fact 10. Sting's nude scene required last-minute G-string. One of the most memorable costume pieces in David Lynch's Dune almost didn't exist at all, as Sting's iconic winged metallic G-string was created at the very last minute due to studio cold feet about nudity. The original script called for the character Feyd-Rautha to emerge from his steam bath completely naked, and the famous musician-turned-actor had already agreed to perform the scene with full frontal nudity. Sting, who was playing the sadistic nephew of Baron Harkonnen, was comfortable with the artistic requirements of the role and had no objections to appearing nude on camera for what was meant to be a brief but dramatically important scene. The sequence was designed to showcase the decadent and twisted nature of House Harkonnen, with Feyd-Rautha's naked emergence from the steamy bath serving as a symbol of his raw, animalistic nature. However, as the filming date for this particular scene approached, studio executives at Universal Pictures began to panic about the potential ratings implications and audience reactions to male nudity in what they hoped would be a mainstream science fiction blockbuster. The studio was already nervous about the film's dark and complex content, and they decided that adding full frontal male nudity would push the movie too far into controversial territory. With the cameras literally ready to roll, the costume department received an emergency order to create something that would cover Sting while still maintaining the sensual and otherworldly aesthetic that Lynch had envisioned for the scene. Working under extreme time pressure, the designers came up with the now famous winged metallic G-string that barely covered the essentials while still looking appropriately futuristic and bizarre. The costume designers had to work through the night to craft this unique piece of wardrobe, using metallic materials and creating the distinctive wing-like extensions that made the garment look both alien and vaguely threatening. The result became one of the most talked-about costume pieces in the entire film, turning what could have been a forgettable nude scene into an iconic moment that fans still discuss decades later. Fact 11. Lynch shared crew with Conan the Destroyer. David Lynch was forced to deal with one of the most unusual cost-cutting measures in Hollywood history when producer Dino De Laurentiis decided to save money by having two completely different fantasy films share the same crew and filming location simultaneously. While Lynch was trying to create his complex and surreal vision of Dune at the Churubusco Studios in Mexico City, another De Laurentiis production called Conan the Destroyer was also shooting at the exact same facility with many of the same workers. This arrangement created a bizarre situation where crew members would literally switch between working on a sophisticated science fiction epic about political intrigue on a desert planet and a sword and sorcery adventure featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger as a barbarian warrior. The two films couldn't have been more different in tone, style, or artistic ambition, yet they were being produced side by side as part of De Laurentiis's plan to maximize the return on his investment in the Mexican studio facilities. For Lynch, this cost-cutting measure represented yet another way that the producer was undermining his creative control over the project. Lynch was already struggling with De Laurentiis's constant interference in lighting decisions and other artistic choices, and now he had to compete for resources and attention with a completely different film that had totally different production needs and schedules. The shared crew arrangement meant that key technical personnel, equipment, and even sound stages had to be divided between the two productions, creating scheduling conflicts and resource shortages that added stress to an already difficult shoot. Lynch would have to wait for certain crew members or pieces of equipment to become available after they finished working on Conan scenes, disrupting the flow and momentum of his own filming schedule. This penny-pinching approach perfectly illustrated De Laurentiis's business-first mentality that prioritized financial efficiency over artistic vision. While the producer saw this as a smart way to reduce overhead costs and maximize profits from his Mexican studio investment, it created additional obstacles for Lynch, who was already fighting an uphill battle to maintain his creative integrity while working under the demanding conditions of an international production. Fact 12. Lynch has an uncredited cameo as spice worker. David Lynch made a brief appearance in his own film by playing an uncredited spice worker, though this cameo is so subtle and well hidden that most viewers have never noticed the director's presence on screen. Unlike many filmmakers who make obvious or memorable cameos in their own movies, Lynch chose to blend into the background as one of the anonymous laborers working in the dangerous spice mining operations on the planet Arrakis. The cameo occurs during one of the scenes showing the harsh working conditions that the spice miners endure while extracting the precious melange from the desert sands. Lynch appears as just another worker among the many extras wearing the same protective gear and costumes as the other spice harvesters, making it nearly impossible to spot him unless you know exactly what to look for and when to look for it. This understated approach to his own cameo reflects Lynch's general attitude toward the film, which he later came to view as a deeply troubled production that didn't represent his true artistic vision. Rather than using his appearance as a chance to showcase himself or create a memorable moment for audiences, Lynch kept his role minimal and almost invisible, treating it more like a practical necessity than a creative choice. The fact that Lynch's cameo remains uncredited in the film's official documentation adds to the mystery surrounding his appearance. While other actors, even those with very small roles, received proper credit for their work, Lynch chose not to formally acknowledge his own brief performance in front of the camera, perhaps reflecting his growing discomfort with the entire production. This hidden cameo has become something of a treasure hunt for dedicated Lynch fans and Dune enthusiasts who try to spot the director in the spice harvesting scenes. The challenge of finding Lynch among all the other workers in their protective gear has turned his brief appearance into one of the film's best-kept secrets, known mainly to hardcore fans who have studied the movie frame by frame over the decades since its release. Fact 13. The film lost $10 million at box office. Dune became one of the most spectacular financial disasters in Hollywood history when it failed to earn back even half of its massive production budget at the worldwide box office. The film cost between $40 and $42 million to make, which put it among the most expensive movies ever produced at that time, costing more than any of the first 3 Star Wars films and roughly 4 times as much as the blockbuster hit E.T. from just 2 years earlier. Despite all the money poured into the production, including the costs of building 80 elaborate sets on 16 sound stages and employing a crew of 1,700 people, Dune managed to earn only about $31 million in total worldwide ticket sales. This meant that the film lost approximately $10 million, not even counting the additional millions spent on marketing and distribution that would have pushed the actual losses much higher. The financial catastrophe was made even worse by the high expectations that Universal Pictures and producer Dino De Laurentiis had placed on the project. They had envisioned Dune as the beginning of a major science fiction franchise that could compete with Star Wars, and they had already announced plans for 2 additional sequels that would complete Frank Herbert's epic story across multiple films. Virginia Madsen, who played Princess Irulan in the film, later revealed that she had actually been signed to contracts for 3 movies because the producers genuinely believed they were creating Star Wars for grown-ups and expected the franchise to generate enormous profits over several installments. The devastating box office performance immediately killed all plans for the announced sequels, leaving the Dune story incomplete and forcing Universal to write off their investment as a total loss. The failure was so significant that it effectively ended any serious Hollywood interest in adapting Frank Herbert's remaining Dune novels for nearly 2 decades, until Denis Villeneuve finally succeeded in bringing the story back to theaters in 2021, with a much more successful adaptation that proved the source material could work when handled differently. Fact 14. Original cut was over 4 hours long. David Lynch's original version of Dune was so drastically different from what audiences eventually saw in theaters that it essentially became a completely different movie by the time Universal Pictures finished cutting it down to a commercially acceptable length. Lynch's initial rough cut, which included all the footage he had shot during the grueling 6-month production in Mexico, ran for more than 4 hours without any of the final special effects or post-production work completed. Even after Lynch trimmed his rough cut and added all the visual effects, his intended final version of the film was still nearly 3 hours long, which he felt was the minimum amount of time needed to properly tell Frank Herbert's complex story with all its political intrigue, religious themes, and character development intact. Lynch believed this length was necessary to give audiences enough time to understand the intricate world-building and relationships that made the Dune universe so compelling. However, Universal Pictures executives were horrified by the idea of releasing a 3-hour science fiction movie, fearing that theaters would only be able to show it a few times per day, which would severely limit their potential box office earnings. The studio demanded that Lynch cut the film down to a standard 2-hour running time that would allow for more daily screenings and higher profits. The massive editing process that followed was nothing short of destructive to Lynch's artistic vision. Entire character arcs were eliminated, crucial plot points were removed, and important scenes that explained key story elements ended up on the cutting room floor. To compensate for all the missing information, the studio forced Lynch to add extensive voiceover narration and film new scenes that would quickly explain plot points that had been properly developed in the longer version. Lynch also lost his final cut privileges during this process, meaning that producer Dino De Laurentiis and Universal executives were making the ultimate decisions about what stayed in the movie and what got removed. This loss of creative control was so devastating to Lynch that he eventually disowned the entire project and has refused to discuss it in detail for decades. Fact 15. Caledon coastline was actually Ireland. While David Lynch's Dune was famously shot entirely in Mexico to take advantage of favorable exchange rates and lower production costs, there was one notable exception that created an unusual international element to the filming process. The brief but important shots of the Caladan coastline, which represent the ocean planet where House Atreides originally ruled before being sent to the desert world of Arrakis, were actually filmed thousands of miles away near Dunlecky Castle on the coast of Ireland. This discovery was made decades after the film's release, when a dedicated Dune fan noticed that the distinctive rock formations visible in the movie's Caladan scenes perfectly matched the coastline near this Irish castle. The fan reached out to film scholars who were able to confirm through original production documents that the special effects company Apogee had indeed conducted filming in Ireland for these specific coastal shots. The Irish filming was apparently done as part of a separate shoot that was organized independently from the main Mexico production, which explains why this location work remained relatively unknown for so many years. Production notes from Apogee revealed that they had budget breakdowns for both a 3-day shoot and a later 4-day reshoot in Oregon. But the actual footage that made it into the final film came from the Irish location instead. The reason for filming the Caladan coastline in Ireland rather than Mexico becomes clear when you consider the visual requirements for these scenes. The planet Caladan, in Frank Herbert's novel, is described as a lush, water-rich world with dramatic ocean vistas that would serve as a stark contrast to the harsh desert environment of Arrakis, where most of the story takes place. Mexico's coastlines simply didn't provide the specific look that Lynch needed for these establishing shots, so the production team had to search internationally for the right combination of rocky cliffs, crashing waves, and atmospheric conditions that would properly represent the Atreides family's beautiful but doomed home world. The Irish coast near Dunlecky Castle provided exactly the dramatic and moody oceanfront scenery that the story required.